Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Feeling Smarter. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Tim Miller. G'day, Tim. How are you?
Yeah, going well, Aaron. How are you doing?
Not too bad, thank you. Well, we're going to continue down the journey of the Treasury draft regulations around legacy pension conversions. And we know that recently these have been published by Treasury for consultation. We're not going to get into the consultation as such, because I know you've been sort of elbow deep in a lot of those conversations. But one of the areas that form part of these draft regulations is allocations from reserves. And there is a fairly profound shift that we're going to see in these regulations if they actually proceed in this way. So, Tim, I might get you to, I guess, in the first instance, just elaborate on some of the proposed shift here, in particular, focusing on the fact that the government's intention ultimately is to see a lot of these reserves ultimately see their way out of SMSFs.
Yeah, so look, I guess it's really good to distinguish between the rules around legacy pensions and the ability to effectively commute them, which is one part of the legislation, which is what the 5-year amnesty is really highlighting there, and the second one, which is a change to the allocation of monies from a reserve. And how they are treated. And of course, something that needs clarity there for people is to understand that we're not exclusively talking about reserves created from these legacy pensions. Either we're talking about reserves that may have been introduced for things like anti-detriment, for self-insurance, for investment smoothing, all sorts of reasons that people might have introduced them over the preceding decades within an SMSF, where potentially provided an opportunity to look to make larger allocations through these, through the introduction of these new regulations. And really what we're looking at, and we'll go through a couple of the more specific rules in a moment, but is a measuring stick where instead of having allocations from reserves potentially counted against an individual's concessional contribution cap, the amounts will be counted towards somebody's non-concessional contribution cap. So in a lot of instances, and as a side note, that in some cases that will be problematic, but in a lot of instances, we're talking there about not only 4 times the limit from a concessional cap point of view, but then an additional 3 times that amount if you're looking at the bring forward provisions under the non-concessional contribution cap. So a greater capacity to allocate more money to reduce the size of these reserves in a shorter time frame.
So, sort of drilling down on this, because you did touch on the fact that there is allocations here that will be looked at in the context of pension reserves, for sake of a better word. So those that were there supporting the payment of a pension, like, for mortality risk and investment risk around that. But then, as you also mentioned, there will be still potentially some other reserves that are sitting around within self-managed funds, noting, of course, that the ATO issued a regulators bulletin back in 2018, but our concessional contribution cap rules around what is fair and reasonable and the 5% allocation requirement was very restrictive in being able to allocate out. So I guess if we focus on the pension reserve bit first, the idea here is to provide some exclusions in respect to those non-concessional caps. And then maybe once you sort of discuss that, how it then differentiates where the introduction of the NCC cap actually comes in.
Yeah, and so again, appreciating that we're looking at draft regulations at the moment, but what we will see is for somebody that is currently paying a legacy pension, so a lifetime pension, you'll have the capacity to allocate the total amount of that reserve, which is inclusive of your annual liability, but then any excess amount sitting in the reserves based on the earnings over the years. All that amount will be able to be allocated to the member to be able to potentially start another account-based pension, to leave it in accumulation, or to take it out of superannuation, right? And in that instance, it won't count towards any contribution caps whatsoever. But then if you go beyond that, and you mentioned fair and reasonable before, there is these other overriding rules that talk about allocations from reserves, and there's a few boxes you had to tick to not have it counted towards a cap. And one of those is that the allocation is on a fair and reasonable basis to all members of the fund, and then talks about subclasses or whatever. For self-managed super funds, we assume all members of the fund, and the amount doesn't represent an amount that is greater than 5% of the members' balances. So it's sort of restricted those allocations to relatively small amounts, given that if you exceeded that 5%, or if it wasn't done fair and reasonably, then it would be counted towards the concessional cap, which until this year was $27,500. Maybe more if you had carry forward or unused concessional amounts. Now, those non-fair and reasonable allocations from any form of reserves will be counted towards a non-concessional cap. So, of course, for anybody with less than 1.9 million from a general transfer balance cap point of view, from their total super balance position, will be able to make quite significant allocations, and the access or the counting against a cap will not be problematic for them.
Yeah, so this goes back to ultimately where we started, where the intention here is here's the opportunity to really back out these reserves where historically we haven't been able to do so.
Yeah, that's right. And that's for your non-pension reserves. And whereas those reserves that are deemed to be pension reserves, so have always been effectively created or were created to pay a pension and still are either paying a pension or the term has ceased, for example, then when those amounts are allocated back to the pensioner, then they will be excluded from all caps and not create any issue for the clients as such.
Yeah. So I guess before we kind of think about some of the next steps, were there any other areas in here that are just worth noting around those allocation rules?
Yeah, look, there are certainly some other considerations with regards to the allocation rules that people need to be mindful of, and that is that it's relatively clear that through the way the regulations are written at the moment of how the rules will apply for those that are in receipt of a legacy pension, so a lifetime fixed term pension. Given the scope that there's very few fixed term pensions that would still be in existence from a term point of view, there is certainly still some clarity that we're seeking in regards to where the pensioner has passed away. So you don't just have one set of rules for all these reserves. You'll have different sets of rules for deceased members, where the reserve's still active, versus living members. So we just need to be mindful of how that operates. But yeah, other than that, I guess there's going to be other key things that people need to watch out for once we get some finality on these regulations.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think from our point of view at Smarter SMSF, I know, Tim, you've been closely working on this with the SMSF Association and discussions with Treasury. And from that point of view, we see there will be a number of steps that need to be looked at, not only around the commutation of those particular income streams that fall within the auspices of these draft regulations, but there'll also need to be steps taken around the allocations from these reserves and the impact of those allocations, whether they are, again, excluded from caps, included to caps, within the construct of someone's total superannuation balance, their transfer balance account, and all those wonderful other acronyms that we talk about within our SMSF industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's it. What we're doing at the moment is we're not even touching the sides with regards to what we're discussing. We're just sort of relatively happy that we're seeing regulations of this level being introduced that are at least going to give us the opportunity to unwind these legacy items, and not just legacy in the terms of pension, but legacy in the terms of reserves, with less tax detriment than potentially what was the case previously.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you once again for joining me for this week's edition of Feeling Smarter.
No worries, always a pleasure.
Excellent, and look forward to you joining us for next week's edition as we move towards our next masterclass, which we're going to be looking at the topic of insurance. Hope you have a great rest of the week. Take care and bye for now.
See you all.